We are now moving to our next speaker, Susan Crumb. Susan spent 40 years in prosecution before recently retiring from the Hennepin County District Attorney's Office in Minnesota. Most recently, she served there as the manager for their complex crimes unit, which investigated and prosecuted financial crimes, including labor trafficking and wage theft. She also played a key role in developing partnerships with worker advocacy groups. And she is here to talk to you about developing labor trafficking and prevailing wage prosecutions. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you for that kind introduction. And I'm very excited to be here. I am recently retired, but workplace justice cases were something I began working on at the tail end of my career when I was in white collar. And previous to that, I mean, I had done everything in the prosecutor's office you can imagine. I was actually in our gang unit right before I went to white collar, but everything that Terry said, totally going on. I'm going to talk to you about a specific case, not so much wage theft, but actually labor trafficking, and share what we learned from that, because it was quite eye-opening. When I went to white collar for the first time in my career, I was getting calls from private attorneys, individuals who lived in the community who were reporting that they had been scammed or they'd been a victim of a fraud. And when I would say, have you called the police? They would say, well, yeah, but the police told me that that was civil. And I had to look at this in a new way and then work with my partners in law enforcement to do the same. And when you look at workplace justice cases, it's, contracts, it's wages, jobs, payroll, insurance. I mean, that's all civil, right? But there are a lot of cases that aren't just civil. They're also criminal, criminal vehicular operation cases, can also have a civil lawsuit, breach of contract, can be contractor fraud, financial exploitation of vulnerable adults, can also have a probate court component, and et cetera. So the dichotomy here, or what happens to cases when they come in the door at the police department, is that initial weeding out. This is a civil matter, it's not criminal, and victims are turned away. But cases can be civil, they can be criminal, or they could be both. And one of the things we need to ask ourselves, as Terry has already pointed out, is why is there no hesitation to think that if an employee steals from an employer, they dip in the till, they take some inventory, that clearly is a criminal matter. But if an employer steals from an employee, that's a civil case. And when you look at that and examine why is that, it really opened my eyes. And also to looking at the power structure of, who has the money, who has the power, who has the ability to protect themselves and make decisions. And what we see is that the employees are the ones who are more vulnerable and less able to protect themselves. So we had a couple of cases that we had done prior to 2016. I know I prosecuted a case that involved theft of payroll deductions. We'd had a private employer who was deducting money from individuals' paychecks for 401k and health insurance, et cetera, and then just kept it. And we'd had a prevailing wage case. But our journey into workplace justice really began in 2016. When a union representative contacted one of our civil attorneys who was responsible for prevailing wage compliance with contractors who did business with our county. And he had some facts he wanted to share with us. He was very concerned. And so I came in and met with them to see if this was something that had legs for a criminal case. And what I heard was quite eye-opening. I had no idea about misclassification. I didn't know anything about the 9-factor test. I didn't know all the exploitation that was going on within the construction industry. So this was kind of our first foray into labor trafficking. And it was a statute that was very seldom used in Minnesota. I think the only labor trafficking cases that had been prosecuted up until this point were alternate charging theories and sex trafficking cases. So this was brand new. We were, paving a new path here. So we heard about these illegal fraudulent practices going on in the construction industry, and it really involved the exploitation of workers in sort of that less skilled area of framing, sheetrock, et cetera, flooring, painting, et cetera. And what was happening is that workers, many of them immigrants or undocumented immigrants, were being exploited financially. They were being housed in really substandard, inhumane conditions. And then when they were injured, they were not allowed to seek medical attention. And what we found was this is the basic scheme. So you've got the general contractor, and you can kind of ask yourself, it sort of sounds like narcotics trafficking, right? You've got the kingpin on the top. You've got the general contractor or construction manager. They hire the sub. The sub then hires the labor broker, who was our defendant in our case. And that labor broker then hires workers, these really vulnerable people, at a much lower wage than would be standard. And that gives them the ability to underbid the law-abiding business people. And one of the ways that they do this is they skirt mandatory workers' compensation insurance. And as Terry mentioned, they do this by misclassifying employees as independent contractors. They then lie to their insurance company and tell them, I don't have any employees. And the expense of workers' compensation is considerable. Particularly, the more dangerous a job is, the higher the cost of that insurance. So our labor broker had no workers' compensation insurance. Workers were getting hurt, and they were not allowed to seek medical care. And then, as Terry mentioned, there are all these other widespread issues that result from a lack of payroll deductions, and also the fact that this individual knew most of his workers were undocumented meant he could hold that over their head and also control their housing. So we learned about this. And also, it became apparent to me that labor trafficking is a person crime, but it has a financial motive. This case really needed to be investigated. And how do I engage a law enforcement agency to open a case and investigate this? And that is kind of one of those, none of this is new. This has been going on, but it really never got to us, this type of criminal activity for potential investigation and prosecution, because it doesn't get through the door in a law enforcement agency. So how do I get a law enforcement agency to look at this case? One of the problems, of course, is these offenses occur across many jurisdictions, not just one city, not just one county. How do you get one law enforcement agency then to engage? It's not really fair to a small department to ask them to take on a complex case and to something that they really don't feel comfortable with. The cases are very time consuming. They're very complex. They involve many search warrants for lots of records, including bank records. Those bank records need to be analyzed. Can we find a law enforcement agency that has the software to populate Excel spreadsheets and do that analysis? And then also, when we have victims who may have immigration issues, does that law enforcement agency have a relationship with Homeland Security investigations or other federal agencies that can assist with making sure we have victims and witnesses when we need to go to trial? I had the benefit of working on many cases with a state law enforcement agency, the Minnesota Department of Commerce Fraud Bureau. And I called them and said, hey, I think we really need to look into this. And they, thankfully for us, agreed to take the case. And this is what we learned. And this is the kind of the basic facts of our case. I hope to, put a little flesh on the bones here for the general information we're giving you, but the company was called American Contractors, and it was owned by a labor broker by the name of Ricardo Batras. This particular business, and he'd had a number of them in the state of Minnesota, engaged in like framing and sheetrock installation in residential housing across many cities in the metropolitan area. And for those of you who might be familiar with Minneapolis, any Prince fans out there. Hennepin County is actually, it's on the west side of the Mississippi. Ramsey County is on the east side, surrounded by a lot of suburbs. So Hennepin County, for example, has like 40 law enforcement agencies. So there were a lot of acts in this offense that occurred in many jurisdictions. He really ramped up his business in 2017. He took in a lot of contracts. He needed a lot of workers. So he was really reaching out to a lot of people, telling them, call your buddies, I've got work for you, and was doing a lot of business in 2017. Made a lot of promises to people about how much he was going to pay them. He was going to pay, they're going to get free housing. He was going to pay for everything. We're going to go on boat rides in the summer. Everything's going to be great. And then, of course, those promises were broken. The workers confronted our defendant about the broken promises, and within days, there was an ICE raid at a house in one of the suburbs here where a bunch of the guys were living. The house had no hot water. There was no beds for them to sleep on. They were sleeping in the floor and like dog feces. I mean, it was really quite horrible, but a number of individuals got arrested. And by the way, he wasn't paying the rent. So it was another broken promise. Our victim in the case, our labor trafficking victim, Jose, was one of the people arrested. Our main witness, Jimmy, was also arrested and then ended up in custody because of the fact that they were not in the country legally. The defendant called him, visited him in jail, said, I've got friends in ICE. I can help you out. I'm going to get you a lawyer. He actually bailed Jose out and then told the authorities, he lives with me. So then, of course, when Jose had to call in, he had to call from the defendant's number and use the defendant's address. So he was still under the defendant's thumb at that time. He also told Jose, you need to work for me now. You've got to pay off the bail. You have to pay off the attorney, who, by the way, never showed up. So he kept control of him after this arrest. We also learned from the investigation that the defendant had no workers' compensation insurance. And again, he was able to avoid the expense of that, lied to the insurance company. We got a lot of insurance records and Department of Labor and Industry records over the years to see this was a typical business practice for him. He'd been fined for it. He'd been warned about it. Insurance brokers had spoken to him about it. So there were a number of records we got there. And then we found a number of workers were injured and he would not allow them to receive medical care. Sometimes he'd send them to like a masseuse person who was another immigrant from Central America. And we talked to her and she was like, oh, I would feel so bad. He would send these boys there and they would literally have broken bones that she could do nothing for. And eventually our main victim, Jose, was badly injured on a job site. They were installing sheetrock. A wall fell on him, fractured his back in multiple places. The workers that were with him were very frightened, but had the presence of mind to actually take a video of him. We had that as evidence in the case. They contacted the defendant and said, we need to take him to the hospital. And he continued to push back and they didn't listen because they were very worried about Jose's condition. They took him to Hennepin County Medical Center, which is the large public hospital here in Minneapolis. And our defendant came down to the hospital, acted as his interpreter, and then told him, you can't tell them this is work related. If you do that, they will deport you. They won't care how badly hurt you are. They'll put you on a plane and they'll send you out of the country. He also told him, you can't tell them it's work related and you need to apply for charity care then. So he pressured him into not reporting the nature of his injuries. And then that also resulted in Hennepin County having to pay for his medical costs. The investigation by the Commerce Fraud Bureau obviously included Jose and Jimmy being interviewed by Commerce by the law enforcement agency. And they had investigators who were cross-deputized with HSI. So they had the ability to obtain deferred action status for them so that they could work legally and not be in custody, and also be here when we needed them to testify. They interviewed many other witnesses, multiple search warrants, lots of insurance records, the business records from the business, medical records, obviously from the victim, many records from the Department of Labor and Industry, and then OSHA. OSHA had also responded to complaints about the working conditions of American contractors. And then also we worked with an advocacy group called SATUL, which is a workers organization. And you're going to be hearing from one of the SATUL advocates here right after me. Really glad that you can have the information that she can share with you. They were very important to the success of our case. And provided a place for us to meet with the witnesses, after hours, so they didn't need to come to the government center and the like. They were absolutely essential to the success of our case. So many records, computer analysis, cell phone analysis. The defendant was using a program called ClockShark for a while, where the workers were supposed to clock in this app, which gave us the identity of workers and venue and hours and dates. And again, that was information that we had to get. I'm trying to remember if they were located in California, but getting that data from ClockShark. So a year later, we charged the case. As I said, the investigation was very complex, but we worked with an excellent law enforcement agency. And we charged the defendant with labor trafficking. And the theory on labor trafficking was the debt bondage relationship that he created with Jose. We also charged him with insurance fraud for lying to his insurance company about not having any employees. And then finally, we charged theft by swindle for directing the victim to lie about the nature of his injuries so that public money would be used for his care. And we were thinking ahead to, we're going to have jurors from all over the place. We don't know what their opinion is about various things in politics, but we thought there might be people that would not be happy with the defendant for requiring that public money then be used for something that insurance should have covered. Now we had some concerns about proof in the case. And, looking at the language of labor trafficking, and then also looking at, how are jurors going to view this case? This is something that is going to be new in our community, a new thing for them to look at. And, one of our concerns was the fact that the defendant didn't transport people. And the statute said, that the defendant, in order to be guilty of trafficking, needed to recruit, transport, transfer, harbor, entice, or obtain. And in this case, he didn't transport the victim here. He had nothing with him coming to the United States. He didn't call him. He didn't entice him. It was actually his friend Jimmy who said, hey, there's work in Minnesota. And so we hung our hat on the harboring with putting them up in the home where they were all residing. So we felt like we addressed that. We also, part of the statute references forced labor or services, which is an incredibly complex part of the statute. And I don't know what your labor trafficking statutes look like in your jurisdiction or if you have one, but ours was sort of a amalgamation of federal statutes and was very challenging. I spent a few days drafting jury instructions here, but suffice it to say, the victims and witnesses weren't chained in a basement. They wanted to work. They came from a country where they had no opportunity at all and were very eager to work. So we were concerned about how jurors would view that. We also knew the defendant at no time said, if you don't do this, I'm going to kill you. He didn't, there weren't overt threats of violence or coercion. He was actually very cagey. The closest thing to a threat he made was he told them he'd been on a hit squad in El Salvador and that he'd killed people. So he sort of implied this lethality to his personality. Most of how he kept control of people was more through his promises that he didn't fulfill, and then his claims of connection to authority. He claimed that he was a volunteer for ICE and that he knew people in high places. He knew people at the Department of Labor and Industry. And then he would actively ask them about their immigration status so that he would know that and then promise he could help them. So it was—
Your 5-minute warning.
Thank you. So we had those concerns, but the case did resolve during jury selection. He pled guilty to labor trafficking and insurance fraud, and he did jail time. He was placed on probation. He did make restitution, and we knew we had the money because we attached money when we filed the criminal complaint. So we did successfully prosecute that case. And I have to tell you, when the case got filed, the general contractor immediately called our office and said we had no idea. I mean, Terry's comment about deterrence is being important in this field, I think is very well taken. And I mean, we prosecuted another case of theft by swindle and insurance fraud for a widespread misclass involving sheetrocking. And it sent shockwaves through the construction industry here when we prosecuted that company. We learned a number of lessons. As I mentioned, I had to be educated about what was going on in the construction industry. I had no idea that this was going on out there. And I did not know the physical, psychological, and financial injury that was being done to individual workers. Also, the widespread societal impact of this, as Terry mentioned, the impact on, legitimate law-abiding businesses, and also the widespread impact on the community because of taxes not being paid when they should. And also the advocates who were so essential to our work really had very little interaction with the criminal justice and system, and they needed education about that process. I think in your materials, there's a copy of the Batres complaint for your review, and then also a case we just charged in December of 2022, which is a prevailing wage case involving an individual who had a contract to provide painting in a project that received public or tax increment financing, which required that he pay workers prevailing wage. And there's a lot of documentation required with that, and did not do so. That case was initially investigated by the City of Minneapolis Department of Human Rights. And then we requested our Sheriff's Department do a criminal investigation. And in that case, you'll notice that in addition to wage theft, there's also a theft by swindle charge. The general contractor in that case paid the workers who had not been paid. So we added a count of theft by swindle to reflect the fact that our defendant lied to the general contractor about the fact that they were paying prevailing wage. So as I mentioned to you, it became clear to me from our journey down this path that we needed to have a way to make sure that workers groups, organized labor, advocacy groups, et cetera, that those people who are being victimized, the vulnerable people in our society, get to law enforcement so that these cases can be investigated and prosecuted. And as part of Professor Gerstein's prosecutors group, I became aware of the fact that labor advisory councils are being used in other jurisdictions to facilitate exactly this type of communication. So it's not my idea. I wish I could say it was, but it's other fellow prosecutors in the United States. And in 2021, Hennepin and Ramsey County joined together either side of the Mississippi to start a labor advisory council to—
Is your 1-minute warning?
To facilitate this communication. It includes the electeds and staff, Department of Labor and Industry here, organized labor, advocacy groups. We have quarterly meetings to work for justice in the workplace, work together on potential legislation, and also facilitate communication with law enforcement and between each other. And the handoff protocol that we developed from that group to identify cases that look criminal should also be in your materials. And also PowerPoint training that we did in November here to help worker groups and organized labor see what a criminal case looks like as opposed to a civil case. And it can be both or neither. But if we have a criminal case that should be receiving attention and get workers the justice they deserve, that's what we should work together on. Thank you.